Texas, 1944. The noon sun bakes the red dirt outside Camp Huntsville. The air hums with cicadas and the faint hiss of a field stove. On the other side of the barbed wire, a dozen Japanese prisoners stand in silence. Their uniforms hang loose. Dust streaks their faces. They don't speak. They barely breathe. A guard yells, "Lunch," and sets a metal tray on the table. Bread, potatoes, and something round, brown, and glistening. A hamburger patty. The smell of grilled beef drifts across the camp. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura stares at it. He had fought in the Philippines. He had watched men die with grenades clutched to their chests rather than surrender. He had been told that Americans were monsters, that captivity was a fate worse than death. But the man handing him food is not a monster. He's a smiling cook in a white apron. The cook says, "Eat. You're safe here." The other prisoners don't move. They think it's a trick. Nakamura sits, picks up the bread with trembling fingers, and takes one small bite. The taste of salt, fat, and smoke floods his mouth. Flavors he hasn't known in years. His throat tightens. His eyes blur. He chews once, twice, then sets the hamburger down. He stands suddenly, swaying. The guards think he's ill, but before anyone can reach him, he collapses, his hands clutching his face, tears streaking through the dirt on his cheeks. No one speaks. The camp goes silent. Even the guards lower their rifles. Later in his report, the American cook writes, "He didn't faint from hunger. He fainted from disbelief." Because in that single moment, Nakamura's world shattered. Everything he had been told about America, about the enemy, about honor, fell apart under the weight of a simple meal. That hamburger served on a tin tray in a Texas camp did what no bomb or bullet could do. It proved that the enemy he had feared for years was capable of kindness, that mercy could be stronger than pride. Years later, when journalists asked Japanese POWs what moment made them realize Japan had lost the war, Nakamura answered without hesitation. "It wasn't Hiroshima," he said. "It was lunch in Texas." He wasn't speaking of surrender on paper, but the death of an idea, the collapse of a belief that cruelty was strength and compassion was weakness. As the sun sank that day, the smell of beef still hung in the air. Guards smoked quietly. The prisoners ate in silence, every bite a small betrayal of the lies they had lived by. For the first time, Nakamura didn't feel like a soldier or a prisoner. He felt human again. And though no one realized it then, that hamburger marked the beginning of something far greater than a meal. It was the moment when an empire's illusion cracked, and the first seeds of peace were planted in the unlikeliest of places. A Texas mess hall, under a sky too big to hate. Before Sergeant Kenji Nakamura ever saw that hamburger, he had been told that surrender was worse than death. In Japan, from childhood, boys were taught that a man's worth was measured by his loyalty to the emperor. Absolute, unquestioning, eternal. The Bushido code was not a choice. It was the air they breathed. To die in battle was honor. To live in captivity was shame. In his military training, instructors shouted until their voices cracked, "The enemy will torture you. They will disgrace your name. You must never be captured alive." Those words echoed in Nakamura's mind as he floated in the Pacific, clinging to wreckage after his transport ship was destroyed. He had expected death. Instead, an American patrol boat found him, exhausted, sunburned, half delirious, and pulled him aboard. He braced for the knife, the rifle butt, the humiliation. But it didn't come. A sailor offered him water. Another wrapped him in a blanket. A medic cleaned the salt burns from his arms. One man even said, "You're lucky we got you. Sharks were circling." Nakamura didn't understand. This wasn't supposed to happen. When the war began, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as savages, beasts who defiled prisoners and desecrated bodies. Newspapers showed crude illustrations of Western soldiers eating from skulls, burning shrines, laughing over corpses. Even officers believed these lies, and so when they fought as if mercy didn't exist. That's why so few Japanese ever became POWs. They would rather die by their own hand. But those who did survive, men like Nakamura, entered captivity not as prisoners, but as ghosts, expecting torment. When he first arrived in the United States, blindfolded and transported by rail across miles of desert, he listened for screams. Instead, he heard laughter, American soldiers telling jokes, singing songs. When the blindfold came off, he expected cages. He found clean barracks, fresh uniforms, showers, and medical treatment. At Camp Huntsville, the guards didn't shout, they didn't strike. They said, "Please." They said, "Thank you." To a man raised in rigid obedience and hierarchy, that was more shocking than any gun. American guards called their officers "Sir," but they also called prisoners "Sir." They obeyed orders, not out of fear, but out of respect. At first, the Japanese POWs refused food, convinced it was poisoned. They whispered among themselves, "They are trying to weaken us." But as the days passed, the truth became impossible to deny. The meals were better than anything they'd had in years. The doctors treated them with care. The guards didn't mock their language or religion. Slowly, the fear that had followed them across the ocean began to crack. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "We expected torture. We found fairness. It was harder to bear than cruelty." Because cruelty could be resisted, with pride, with hatred, with defiance. But kindness? Kindness disarmed the spirit. When Nakamura lay in his bunk that first night, he didn't sleep. He stared at the wooden ceiling and listened to the hum of distant insects, wondering how his country could have been so wrong. If this was the enemy, what exactly had they been fighting? That question, quiet, dangerous, and undeniable, would haunt him long after the war was over. By 1944, America's prisoner of war system had become one of the largest and most organized in history. Across 46 states, more than 400 camps stretched from the pine forests of Wisconsin to the open plains of Texas. Each camp was a small, self-contained city, complete with barracks, hospitals, workshops, schools, and theaters. Texas alone held nearly 50,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and a small but significant number of Japanese. The heat, the space, and the abundance of farmland made it ideal for both containment and rehabilitation. The U.S. Army called it controlled humanity. The Geneva Convention guided every rule. Prisoners were to receive medical care, fair rations, access to correspondence, and religious freedom. But in America, those standards weren't just met, they were exceeded. At Camp Huntsville, the same camp where Sergeant Kenji Nakamura was held, the daily menu was posted on a bulletin board. Breakfast, eggs, bread, coffee. Lunch, beef, potatoes, vegetables. Dinner, stew or chicken. The food wasn't luxurious, but it was plentiful, balanced, and prepared by Army cooks who followed regulations to the calorie. There were infirmaries staffed with trained nurses, classrooms run by American officers, and even libraries filled with donated books, including Japanese literature, translated by volunteers from universities. The philosophy was simple. A soldier might be an enemy, but he was still a human being. To many Americans, it was a matter of principle. "If we treat them decently," one officer said, "we show the world what we're fighting for." And so, paradoxically, even as American bombers burned Tokyo, other Americans were teaching Japanese prisoners how to read English, how to operate farm machinery, how to weld. Captivity became a classroom. The contrast with Japanese-run POW camps in Asia was staggering. While American camps followed the Geneva Convention, Japanese camps often ignored it entirely. Allied prisoners under Japanese control endured starvation, disease, forced labor, and executions. Many never returned. When Red Cross inspectors toured U.S. facilities, they reported almost no violations. At one camp, an inspector noted with disbelief that the prisoners were given ice cream on Sundays. At another, Japanese POWs played baseball with their guards. The camps were not luxurious. They were disciplined. Every action, every schedule, every regulation served a dual purpose: to maintain order and to model a kind of civilization the Axis powers had dismissed as decadent. The irony was profound. In Japan, officers preached that democracy made men soft. But here, democracy was feeding and sheltering its enemies. Not out of weakness, but strength. And that strength was built on something Japan could never replicate: a vast industrial machine that seemed capable of producing everything, from tanks and planes to typewriters and toothpaste. The same nation that had created the assembly line now applied it to compassion. By the time Nakamura's transport train arrived in Huntsville, the system ran like clockwork. Guards greeted new prisoners with standardized instructions, translators briefed them on camp rules, and medical officers performed checkups within hours of arrival. No chaos, no brutality, just efficiency. Standing in line that day, Nakamura studied the guards' calm faces and wondered what kind of country fought war with this level of order, and still found time to offer its captives a hot meal. Later in his diary, he would write, "They make even mercy a process, and that process is perfect." In war, numbers tell the truth that propaganda tries to hide. By 1944, America's factories were producing 96,000 planes per year, 8,000 per month, nearly 300 every single day. The nation built 40,000 tanks, millions of rifles, and over 10 billion rounds of ammunition. But those were just the military numbers. The deeper shock came from what America could make while still fighting a world war. While Japanese civilians boiled tree bark to survive, Americans were mass-producing Coca-Cola. While Tokyo rationed a handful of rice per person, American mess halls served beef, butter, and coffee not only to soldiers, but even to prisoners. When Japanese POWs saw the sheer abundance of America, they began to understand something terrifying. This wasn't just an enemy with weapons. It was an entire civilization built on production, energy, and belief in progress. In Camp Huntsville, Nakamura saw the evidence everywhere. Trucks delivered food daily. Uniforms were washed and replaced with military precision. Medical supplies arrived in bulk, labeled, categorized, tracked. Even the trash was organized. Nothing ran out. Nothing broke down. He asked one guard, a Texan named Dalton, "Where does it all come from?" Dalton shrugged. "From home, I guess. We just make more." Make more. That was the phrase Nakamura never forgot. In Japan, make more was impossible. There were shortages of steel, fuel, rubber, even paper. Japan's entire war machine had relied on imports from territories it no longer controlled. Factories in Osaka and Nagoya worked by candlelight. Workers starved at their stations. But America, thousands of miles from the front, ran its war as if it were an engineering project. Women filled the assembly lines. Children collected scrap metal. Every machine, every resource, every man was part of a vast coordinated rhythm. To the Japanese prisoners, that rhythm sounded like destiny. The camp had its own canteen, stocked with soap, razors, even postcards. When Nakamura saw American guards casually discard half-finished meals, he felt both awe and despair. He wrote in his diary, "They throw away more in one day than we could eat in a week. They have so much they no longer see it." For years, Japan's officers had preached that America was weak, a land of lazy consumers and selfish individualists. But now Nakamura saw the truth. That very individualism was the source of strength. Where Japan demanded obedience, America encouraged initiative. Where Japan punished failure, America learned from it. Where Japan hoarded, America shared. He realized that America's industrial might was not just material, it was moral. A system that fed even its enemies could not be destroyed by bombs alone. When word spread through the camp that American farmers were paid by the government not to grow certain crops because there was too much food, the prisoners laughed in disbelief. One whispered, "They make waste a policy." Another murmured, "That is power." Back home, Nakamura's wife and children lived under nightly air raids, surviving on scraps. He thought of them whenever he saw the camp kitchen dump leftovers into the trash. At first it filled him with bitterness, then with sorrow, finally with understanding. This was why Japan could never win, not because her soldiers lacked courage, but because courage couldn't fill an empty stomach. The math of collapse, Nakamura wrote later, was not about bullets. It was about calories. The numbers told the story plainly. America was producing more food, fuel, and machines than the entire Axis combined. And in Texas, even prisoners could taste that victory in every bite. It happened on a morning that began like any other, hot, still, and heavy with the smell of mesquite and dust. The guards had announced that a group of Japanese prisoners would be sent to help on a nearby Texas ranch, a routine work detail the Army used to supplement local labor shortages. Nakamura volunteered, mostly to escape the monotony of the camp. He didn't know that this day would alter his entire view of the enemy, and of himself. The ranch was owned by a family named Porter. The men were away fighting in Europe, but their father and two daughters ran the place with the steady efficiency of people who'd been working the land their whole lives. When the army truck arrived, the POWs were handed over under strict orders. No contact, no fraternization, no special treatment. But Texans, especially ranchers, had their own code. By noon, the sun had turned the field into a furnace. The prisoners worked silently, repairing fences and hauling feed. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes, soaking their shirts. Not one of them complained. The guards watched, impressed. Around midday, Mrs. Porter appeared carrying a tray, not of water, but of steaming plates. Bacon, eggs, biscuits, and something the POWs had never seen before, Coca-Cola bottles glistening with condensation. The guards froze. They knew the rules. No shared meals. No personal offerings. But Mrs. Porter wasn't taking orders from the army that day. She smiled and said, "They've worked hard. You boys sit and eat too." The POWs hesitated, unsure if it was a test or a trick. Nakamura stared at the bacon, crisp, rich, and golden, and the dark, fizzing drink beside it. The smell alone made his hands tremble. For a moment, no one moved. Then a guard muttered, "Go on, it's fine." The first bite hit like a revelation. Salt, smoke, and fat, flavors he hadn't tasted in years. Then the Coca-Cola, sharp and sweet and cold enough to sting his teeth. For a second, Nakamura forgot the barbed wire, the war, the humiliation. He was just a man eating food made with care. When he looked up, he saw Mrs. Porter watching from the porch, her face soft with something he couldn't name. Kindness, maybe pity, but not hate. That was when one of the younger prisoners began to cry, silent at first, then shaking, his face buried in his hands. The others froze, unsure how to react. In Japan, tears were shameful. But here, under the Texas sun, no one mocked him. Even the guards looked away to give him privacy. It wasn't just hunger being fed that day. It was humanity. Later that evening, Nakamura wrote, "We expected chains. We found chairs. We expected cruelty. We found cooking. That day, the war ended inside me." The next morning, when the work detail returned to camp, they were different. The guards noticed it first. The quiet respect. The lack of tension. The POWs no longer flinched at orders or hesitated when spoken to. Something invisible had shifted. Word spread quickly through the barracks. The ranchers had fed them like guests, not captives. In a war of bombs and blood, one meal of bacon and Coca-Cola had done what bullets could not. It had dismantled years of fear and hate. Nakamura didn't know it yet, but he and his fellow prisoners had just become witnesses to something historians would later call the Texas experiment, the American belief that decency could be a weapon more powerful than any gun. To understand why that meal happened, why cowboys in Texas chose to share food with their nation's enemies, you have to understand the people themselves. Cowboys weren't soldiers by training, but they lived by an unwritten code. You don't kick a man who's already down, and you don't let another man go hungry on your land. When the Army began sending German and Japanese POWs to ranches across Texas, local ranchers were skeptical. The war had taken their sons, brothers, and husbands. Some had been killed by Axis forces. Yet when the first work details arrived, most Texans reacted not with hatred but curiosity. "They looked like boys," said rancher Henry Porter years later. "Not monsters, just boys with tired eyes." For the Porters, and many like them, feeding the POWs wasn't rebellion. It was instinct. These were men who'd survived the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and droughts that could starve a herd in a season. They understood hardship, hunger, and loss. To them, mercy wasn't softness. It was survival made visible. The U.S. Army officially discouraged personal contact between civilians and prisoners, but enforcement was loose. In small towns, everyone knew everyone. The guards were often locals themselves, young men unfit for combat, but loyal to duty. They knew that treating POWs decently kept order and prevented trouble. And in Texas, keeping order sometimes meant doing things the right way, not the official way. Many cowboys saw it as a test of character. The Germans were disciplined workers. The Japanese were relentless. Once the initial mistrust faded, the two groups found common ground with their Texan overseers: hard work, pride, and quiet respect. A cowboy named Jake Harlan, who worked alongside POWs near College Station, recalled, "We didn't talk much. You didn't need to. A nod, a shared tool, that was enough." Over time, work details became unlikely partnerships. The POWs repaired fences, harvested crops, and learned to ride. In return, they were treated with a rough fairness that didn't exist in their own armies. They weren't gentle, one German prisoner later said, but they were just. This was what made Texas different. While much of the world was consumed by revenge, Texans still believed in the line between justice and cruelty. Even war didn't erase that. At the end of each workday, guards would drive the prisoners back to camp. The cowboys sometimes sent them off with a wave, or a leftover biscuit wrapped in cloth. No one said the word friend, but everyone understood. And while the Army called these men enemies, the cowboys had a simpler term: workers. One evening, when a new Army inspector asked why the Porters had fed their POW detail, Henry simply said, "Because they were hungry." The inspector frowned. "You know they're the enemy, right?" Henry replied, "Son, out here, a man's stomach doesn't care what flag he fights under." That quiet defiance captured what made the American home front so strange and so powerful. Where totalitarian nations demanded hatred as proof of loyalty, America allowed humanity to coexist with strength. To the POWs, it was incomprehensible. To the Texans, it was just life. And that simple philosophy, duty without hatred, was the invisible weapon that broke through years of propaganda more effectively than any bomb or bullet ever could. As Nakamura later wrote, "In Texas, even the men who could shoot us chose to feed us instead. I began to wonder which side was truly civilized." For weeks after the meal on the Porter Ranch, Nakamura carried a strange heaviness that no guard could see. It wasn't hunger or fear anymore. It was the slow collapse of something deeper. Pride, the kind that had been drilled into him since boyhood. Every Japanese soldier had been raised to believe surrender was shame, mercy was weakness, and the enemy was less than human. The Bushido code demanded absolute loyalty and death before dishonor. But now, in the wide-open plains of Texas, That creed was falling apart, not through force, but through kindness. It started small. A cowboy lent him a pair of gloves when his hands blistered. A nurse at the camp hospital gave him aspirin without asking rank or nationality. A guard nodded to him in passing, not as a captive, but as a man. Each gesture chipped away at the armor of his indoctrination. The breaking point came one afternoon when a Red Cross truck arrived at Camp Huntsville with care packages. Inside were soap, socks, and letters from volunteers, ordinary Americans who wrote to the enemy with words of goodwill. One letter, written by a schoolgirl from Kansas, said simply, "My brother fought in the Pacific. I hope this helps you feel better. Please don't give up on the world." Nakamura read it twice, then 3 times. His hand trembled. He had seen villages burned, ships sunk, men starved to death on islands. Yet here, in the land of his enemy, a young girl who had lost her brother still wished peace to a man like him. It was more than he could comprehend. That night, at dinner, the camp served meatloaf and mashed potatoes, a feast by wartime standards. One of Nakamura's closest friends, Corporal Sato, took a bite, put down his fork, and began to cry. At first, Nakamura thought it was exhaustion. Then Sato whispered, "My wife. She hasn't eaten meat in 2 years." No one at the table spoke. They sat in silence, the weight of realization pressing down like a stone. This was the moment they all understood. The Americans hadn't just beaten Japan with planes or tanks. They had beaten them with plenty. With the belief that no one needed to starve to prove loyalty, no one needed to die to prove honor. For the first time, Nakamura felt something close to envy. In his diary, he wrote, "We were told America was a land of greed, but greed does not share food with enemies. Greed does not send soap to strangers. If this is greed, then it is holy." The guards noticed a change in the prisoners after that. Fewer arguments, more cooperation. Some POWs even volunteered for extra work, asking to help in the camp garden or kitchen. They said it was to pass time, but it was something else, a quiet need to repay kindness with effort. One morning, when Mrs. Porter sent fresh eggs from the ranch as a gift to the POW cooks, Nakamura helped carry the crates into the kitchen. A guard thanked him. He bowed instinctively, a gesture of respect that once belonged only to his emperor. Something had shifted permanently. The war had stripped him of his uniform, his sword, and his cause. But the Americans, without meaning to, had given him something new, the ability to see dignity in others, and maybe, someday, in himself. That night, as he stared through the barbed wire at the Texas stars, he whispered, "We came here as soldiers. We will leave as men." Christmas Eve, 1944. The war was still raging across Europe and the Pacific, but in the quiet fields of Texas, something extraordinary unfolded behind the barbed wire of a prisoner of war camp. The guards at Camp Huntsville were preparing for a simple evening. Black coffee, a radio broadcast from New York, maybe a game of cards. But as the sun dipped behind the pines, a sound drifted from the POW barracks. Soft, low, unmistakably German. A hymn. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Silent night. The guards froze. The tune rolled out across the yard, melancholy yet peaceful. And then something unexpected happened. One of the American soldiers, a young guard named Private Jack Harlan, stepped into the cold, holding his harmonica. He began to play along. The melody joined with the voices, the harmony bridging 2 enemies through a song both sides knew by heart. By the time the final note faded, the entire camp had gone silent. No one spoke. The prisoners stood at the windows, the guards stood by the fence, and for a few minutes there was no war. Inside Barrack 12, Nakamura sat quietly with Sato and 2 others. They had been given permission to hang a small paper star above the table, Dinner was modest: bread, potatoes, a slice of canned ham. But there was something else that stunned them even more. A few hours earlier, the guards had delivered small parcels, care packages from local churches and the Red Cross. Inside were candy bars, cigarettes, even a handful of postcards with the words, "Merry Christmas to you, wherever you are." Nakamura turned the card over and whispered, "They celebrate peace, even in war." He wasn't alone in his disbelief. Other POWs stared at the gifts, unsure whether to open them or not. One German soldier muttered, "It's a trick." Another replied, "Then let it be the kindest trick ever played." When the Americans lit a bonfire outside the main gate later that night, the glow spread across the yard like an unspoken invitation. A few prisoners stepped closer to the fence, uncertain. The guards didn't raise their rifles. They nodded. From the kitchen came the smell of roasted meat. Army cooks were preparing a small feast for the garrison, and as the food was served, a few paper plates were quietly handed through the wire. Bacon, beans, cornbread. A German POW hesitated, then saluted with the edge of his plate. One of the guards saluted back with his fork. Nakamura would later write, "In that moment, the wire between us no longer separated enemies. It only divided two kinds of hunger, one for food and one for peace." Hours later, when lights went out across the camp, a few prisoners stayed awake, whispering about the war, their homes, and the strange kindness of the Americans. Some admitted for the first time that they no longer hated their captors. One guard, lying awake in his own bunk, wrote in his journal, "They sang our Savior's song. If they can sing that, maybe there's hope after all." For years, no one spoke officially of that night. It wasn't in army reports or camp records. But decades later, when veterans and former prisoners reunited, many mentioned it first: the song, the silence, and the shared humanity of a Texas Christmas behind barbed wire. For Nakamura, it became the night he stopped being a soldier and started being a man again. He later said, "It wasn't the end of the war that freed me. It was that song." May 1945. The war in Europe had ended, Germany had surrendered, and though the Pacific still burned, word reached even the most remote corners of the Texas camps. It was over. On the morning the news broke, the loudspeakers in Camp Huntsville crackled to life. "Attention! Germany has unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe is at an end." At first there was silence, then murmurs, then the sound of benches scraping against the floor as hundreds of prisoners stood stunned. Some cried openly, some laughed in disbelief, and others, like Nakamura, just stared at the dirt beneath their boots, unsure what to feel. The guards were quiet too. Victory had been their mission, but seeing it unfold like this, in the faces of men who had once sworn to die rather than yield, brought little satisfaction. That night, as the sun dropped low, the gates remained locked, but the atmosphere felt different. The guards allowed the POWs to gather outside their barracks. There was no shouting, no curfews, no threats. Just men sitting together, watching the sky fade from gold to gray. One German prisoner, an officer, approached a guard and asked softly, "What will happen to us now?" The guard shrugged. "We'll find out together, I guess." That was Texas. No hatred, just the acceptance that all wars eventually run out of reasons. Nakamura knew Japan was next. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it in his bones. The camps buzzed with rumors about the bombings, about a weapon more powerful than anything seen before. Some prisoners whispered that Japan would fight to the last man. Others prayed it wouldn't come to that. Days turned into weeks. The POWs kept working, mending fences, tending crops, repairing roads. But something had changed. The Americans treated them less like captives and more like workers waiting for a train home. Then, one morning, the guards gathered the men in the yard. A captain stepped forward, reading from a sheet of paper. "By order of the War Department, Repatriation procedures will begin within weeks. You will be returned to your homelands in groups as transportation becomes available. No one cheered. Many just stood silently, the reality washing over them. Freedom. After years of indoctrination, hunger, defeat, and captivity, freedom had come not through conquest, but through mercy. That night, Nakamura walked to the edge of the fence where the barbed wire caught the moonlight. A guard named Dalton was leaning against a post, chewing on a toothpick. "Going home soon?" Dalton asked. Nakamura nodded. "Yes, I don't know what I will say to them." Dalton smiled faintly. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them we weren't monsters." Nakamura hesitated, then replied, "And if they don't believe me?" "Then tell them you saw a cowboy share his lunch with a prisoner," Dalton said. "That ought to do it." When the first transport trucks finally rolled out, carrying the POWs toward the coast, the Americans lined the fences. Some waved, some saluted, and a few, including Mrs. Porter, came to see them off with baskets of food and water. As Nakamura climbed aboard, he looked back one last time at the ranch beyond the horizon, the land of dust, sunlight, and kindness that had changed him forever. He wrote in his notebook, "We lost the war of guns, but we lost it to men who fed their enemies before the battle was even done." That line would be printed decades later in a Japanese newspaper under the headline, "The Prison That Taught Us Freedom." Years later, long after the barbed wire had been taken down and the camps turned back into fields, Nakamura returned to Texas. He came not as a prisoner, but as an old man on a quiet pilgrimage, to see the land where his hatred had died. He found the spot easily. The trees were taller now, and the guard towers were gone, but the wind still carried that same dry whisper through the grass. Nearby, a plaque stood half buried in the soil. Site of Camp Huntsville, Wabiupuipu Prisoner of War Camp, 1942 to 1945. Nakamura stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands. A young rancher drove by in a pickup and stopped to ask if he needed help. "No," Nakamura said softly. "I just came to thank this place." The man smiled, not quite understanding. "You served here?" "Yes," Nakamura replied, "but not the way you think." The young Texan offered him a bottle of Coca-Cola, cold from the cooler in the truck bed. Nakamura laughed quietly and accepted. The first sip brought him back across 50 years, back to the ranch table, the plate of bacon, the moment when a nation of strangers had shown him more humanity than his own government ever had. That taste had ended something inside him, not just the war, but the idea that enemies had to stay enemies forever. Back in Japan, Nakamura had become a teacher, one who refused to glorify war. When his students asked how he survived America's prison camps, he would smile and say, "Because they gave me breakfast." He explained that America's real weapon wasn't the bomb or the tank or even the mighty B-29. It was abundance without arrogance, the ability to share what it had, even with those who had tried to destroy it. He called it the taste of victory. Historians would later agree. The treatment of POWs in the United States, particularly in Texas, became a cornerstone of post-war reconciliation. Thousands of former prisoners returned home telling the same story. Not of torture or hate, but of generosity that defied everything they had been taught. For many, that story changed how the world viewed America, not as a conqueror, but as a nation that believed mercy could win wars just as surely as might. As Nakamura finished his drink, he placed the empty bottle on the ground beside the plaque and whispered, "You taught me that freedom tastes like kindness." Then he turned, walked back to the road, and disappeared into the Texas sunset. An old soldier who had once fought for an empire, but now carried only gratitude. In the War of Steel and Smoke, the story of Camp Huntsville reminds us, America's quietest victory wasn't written in blood, but in the simple act of feeding a hungry man.